Security knows viruses, but the pandemic introduces new challenges to security teams. So we've seen the world's largest proof of concept, right? And that is when it comes to IT, right? And that is work from home, right? Not that work from home is new, but certainly the scale in which work from home was pushed out to accommodate businesses' need to continue to operate during the pandemic. And so if we look at the initial focus, what were we doing initially when the pandemic started to happen and quarantine and work from home was mandated, right? And so what we saw was a real strong focus around increased VPN capacity, right? So scrambling of IT teams, building out additional licensing and increased capacity to terminate the VPN tunnels. And that was the primary focus, right? It was really about getting people connected, right, as soon as possible. And then what happened was, as we started to connect these people, we started seeing the supported infrastructure being stretched, right, to its absolute limit. So, 100% oversubscribed in a lot of cases. And when I say the supporting infrastructure, I'm not talking about the VPN head ends necessarily, right? Because we hopefully addressed that during the first bullet there, right? This is really about the switch infrastructure, maybe firewalling components, other supporting infrastructure, internet capacity as an example, because we built the initial VPN need for a subset of users, right? We were never 100% dependent on running our business through that internet circuit, right? And obviously that's going to pose additional risks, but then we get that piece solved, right? We've gotten additional licensing, hardware and software for the VPN head end, and we increase capacity maybe in the switch, firewall components that make up part of that supporting infrastructure. And if that wasn't enough, what we started to do was introduce things like split tunneling. And so we needed to offload some of the internet connectivity or connectivity that may be needed from time to time or users do during their breaks. We needed to offload some of that capacity. The reason why, again, is the increased load that we were introducing to our VPN infrastructure. The problem with split tunneling is now that we've got one leg straight out potentially to the internet, another leg that's directly connected to our corporate infrastructure. And again, risk is there, but the immediate need was focused on getting people capability. Increased web services, right? So we rushed to introduce web services for direct access. So if you weren't driving VPN capabilities, you may have moved services sooner, whether that be in your DMZ today, offering services for users to be able to connect, or you've introduced SaaS-based capabilities or increased the SaaS usage that you may have been just introducing to the environment. And again, because the rush to introduce the capability, there's certainly risk that we are introducing. And like I said, SaaS-based capabilities. So whether that be a web-based or traditional web-based capability, like, your own infrastructure in DMZ and services being offered there, or it's some cloud-based capability as well. And all of this has introduced risk when it comes to security, but also the increased number of users that weren't traditionally work from home users, right? They've had to quickly adapt and change to the way they work. And they're used to having access through a very controlled environment. And they probably trust the technologies to a certain degree. And the security elements were part of that package. And now we have new users that have been rushed to leverage this work from home capability, but not really focused on the security capability or the education to ensure that our users understand the differences of work from home. So security becomes a big question. And so the initial focus within the first 4 to 10, 12 weeks was really about getting this piece up and running. It wasn't really about focusing on security. And now what we're seeing is people are coming back and saying, wait a minute, what have I done, right? I've increased this capacity to work from home. But I haven't thought of all the security implications that might come to fruition because of it. And so what is the threat? So if you look at ever since COVID and the pandemic started, right, we have to start thinking about COVID-19 phase 2 or what's happening in the fall, right? We haven't seen what that impact's going to look like. Does that mean that we reverse some of the stuff that we've done? If we've started bringing people back into the office, do they start, having to work from home again? Or what happens because this has been a perfect use case that's been probably tested more than many other technologies ever deployed in IT? Do we see a shift? Do we see a shift that people are looking at reducing, office space and allowing flexibility to work from home or work from home moving forward? Because it's proven that it works. You don't need to be in an office to be fully functional and providing value. And so when we look at the threats, we can see that there's a ton of them, right? So malicious cyber actors spoofing COVID-19 loan relief web pages via phishing emails, right? So phishing certainly becomes a big problem again. It doesn't mean that the problem never existed. It just, the adversary has seen COVID-19 as an opportunity to get people to click. We see FBI releases guidance around defending against VTC hijacking and Zoom bombing, right? We got malicious activity targeting COVID-19 research, right? So vaccine development. We have reports that talk about DDoS attacks increased over 500% because of COVID-19. And people might not realize why, but you got to remember, you're now 100% reliant on that VPN connectivity. And so if I'm an adversary that wants to cause some disruption, it's easier for me to cause some disruption to your organization by impacting that internet connectivity or that VPN head end that provides the VPN service. And if I can disrupt that, I've essentially taken your business down. Before, if I was an adversary and targeted that internet connectivity, I would disrupt you potentially with services that you're offering and some internet connectivity that your users are using. But the bigger problem, or the lesser of the problem, would be that internally people probably are still fully functional, right? Because they're internal, plugged into or wirelessly connected, and have services through the on-premise data center. So that becomes critical, right? Things like DNS and resolution become critical as well, right? If that is disrupted, that could take down some of your SaaS-based services, right? If that's disruptive, that might take down some of your VPN connectivity as well. And enterprise VPN security becomes a big issue, right? We've talked a little bit about this, right? So more vulnerabilities are being found and targeted by malicious actors. VPNs are 24/7, so they're less likely to keep updated with the latest security patches, right? Malicious cyber actors may increase phishing emails. We've seen that in a couple of the other comments already. Organizations that don't use multi-factor now have given the adversary a channel into their organization. Now, this has always existed, but it becomes greater because we've got this influx of users that are connected to our environment and may not be as work from home savvy as somebody that may have been doing it for a decade. Organizations may have limited number of VPN connections, after which no other employee can telework. So with decreased availability, critical business operations may suffer. So again, right, the VPN becomes the bottleneck, but also IT relies on it in order to provide cybersecurity functionality and tasks, right? How do I do things like patching? And we're going to talk a lot about that. Also, things like APT Groups, right? Using COVID-19 as part of their cyber operations, right? So these actors masquerade as trusted identities, right? This includes things like coronavirus-themed phishing messages, malicious applications, often masquerading as trusted entities that may have previously compromised. So cyber criminals are using the pandemic, obviously, for commercial gain. So phishing, malware distribution, right, with COVID-19 lured themes. Registrations of new domain names containing the word COVID-19, and attacks to newly and often rapidly deployed remote access teleworker. So these are just some examples, right? And you can see a lot of them have, the same themes, right? The adversary hasn't, tremendously changed the way they've done business. They're using the same types of techniques, right? But what we've done is we've seen them now focus it towards COVID-19, right? And you got things like clicking a link that leads to a phishing website that downloads malware. Anybody in security knows that, right? But you have to think about, how do you deal with this when your users are remotely connected, right? And maybe not always connected, right? Because remember, you've had to do the split tunneling. And there's other risks too, because the home has become the classroom, right? And so are your workers having to let their children, the student, use those laptops for work or for school, And do they use it for internet browsing, right? And so does that increase the risk? Because they're maybe at that point not even connected to VPN if they have that choice, right? They've completely disconnected. And this one here, if you look at it, is around COVID-19 scammers are using data breaches in Canada. So this is hitting home, right? This is real. And so some of the things that we're seeing is, they're offering help with previous pandemic data breaches. They are targeting Canadians with supplies like masks and hand sanitizer. They're capitalizing on some I love this one, high-profile data breaches. So they're suggesting that they have been breached, and this is what you need to do to move forward, right? Or there was a breach, and they're here to help you. And so it's interesting how they're transitioning, right? As we continue to become smarter users, the adversary is using that potentially against us, right? We know if a data breach happens, there's probably actions we need to take to either understand the risk to us, but also mitigate future risk that may be associated with the breach. And also August 15th, the Canadian government announced 5,500 revenue agency accounts were compromised in what is known as credential stuffing attack. So this is where hackers went and leveraged, data from previous data breaches and used it to log into CRA accounts, and were able to change banking information in those accounts and have some of these benefits due to COVID-19 sent to these bank accounts. And this one certainly hit home. I know somebody that actually was hit by this particular scam when it happened. So we're going to talk about a couple of use cases. So previously in other conversations, I've talked about really taking a step back and looking at the flows and securing those flows. And so what I've done here is I've taken that work from home user flow and I've broken it up a little bit. So the first flow is internet. The internet use case includes users going directly to internet or split tunneling. Okay. SaaS. So the SaaS use case includes users going directly to SaaS-based services using native TLS. The beautiful thing with SaaS or even web services that you're offering in the DMZ is the ability to use native capabilities, right? And not having to run an overlay on top of it just to run that security protocol underneath. And so using TLS with SaaS or web-based services certainly is streamlining the process and reducing complexity. But there's some things we got to think about too from a security perspective. And the VPN use case includes users going directly to the VPN head end, accessing resources. Okay, so these are all things that we're probably fairly familiar with, at least from a corporate perspective. But have we really thought about these from a work from home perspective? And some of the things we want to think about are some of the things that we talked about. So things like phishing, right? Malware, forensics. How are we going to deal with these things, right? System hygiene, DDoS, direct internet, social engineering, DNS outage, split tunneling, right? So obviously there's an opportunity here to educate your users about work from home, right? That is certainly something people should consider if you haven't done this already. But there's a lot more things, right, from a technology perspective that we have to consider as well. Credential theft and more, right? And so what I've done is I've broken this up into those 3 use cases. And we're going to walk through each one of those use cases. Work from home, work from coffee shop, work from wherever. Let's look at this from a prevention perspective. We've got patching, right? Patching's still a big problem, right? We got to do it. We've got to be religious about it. System hygiene is key. So we got to use tools in order to extend this capability from work from home. This might be extended through the VPN. It might be extended through TLS. But we've got to consider it. We've got to make sure that we're patching these systems even when they're connected remotely. You've got exploit prevention and system process protection. So exploit prevention is really focused around memory injection attacks that are used by malware targeting 0 days, specifically around things like unpatched software vulnerabilities. Again, if we can patch, we may not have this issue, but we can't maybe patch 100% of everything. And again, if it's 0 day, there might be other ways of minimizing that risk, which exploit prevention may help with. System process protection, we're just making sure that we're protecting those Windows system processes from not being compromised, again, maybe through memory injection attacks by other processes. You get into advanced malware protection and AV, right? This is, been something we've been doing for a very, very long time. We might want to consider multi-engine type approach, right? Going through multiple detection capabilities to minimize risk. But I would think that everybody at this stage has at least AV and some advanced malware capability. Malicious activity protection. So this defends your endpoints from ransomware attacks by identifying malicious actions of processes when they execute certain activities like encrypting the data, right? If it starts to encrypt the data, maybe the other controls have failed or inspection mechanisms failed. Now we want to cut it off, right? We want to stop whatever it's doing. Application blocking. So blocking potentially vulnerable applications, right? If we know an application is vulnerable, we might want to block that application from being able to run on the endpoint. Also, there might be certain applications we don't want to run on an endpoint, right? Because it exposes us to certain risks. Network blocking. So this comes into, IP block and allow lists, blocking certain IPs to certain destinations that we know are bad. Our USB blocking, right? The ability to be able to minimize the risk of a USB being plugged in that may have been compromised or have compromised data on it. And we all know that work from home, we also have students from home, right? Children working from or learning from the home. And so, there's a very good chance that students might be borrowing their parents' corporate asset, even if policy suggests otherwise, because they're stuck and they need to get something done. Or they have limited resources in the house, and they have multiple children, right, to support. So we might want to consider USB blocking, right, because the risks that come with that. Again, usability is important. So you may have to allow it, and then you have to rely on other controls. IPS, right, intrusion prevention, right, whether that be host-based or extended further, whether that be in the cloud or backhauled into an on-premise type connection. If it was always on VPN as an example, you have additional controls that you would traditionally in a corporate environment. You get firewalling, L3, L4 type controls, right? Port, destination, IP, etc., right? But you could extend this maybe to L7 type controls, where now you're defining the application and allowing and denying maybe access to certain destinations. You move into file lists, right? And I'm calling this out more because we know the marketing terms out there, right? But exploit prevention and system process protection is going to help a little bit with this, but this is really where we start seeing threats in memory that invoke their will against the asset, and so traditional mechanisms or on disk file activity doesn't get invoked, right? Because it's all done in memory. So we need detection capabilities there as well. And detection, I mean prevention, right? Ultimately, detection's good, but ultimately we want to prevent. Then you get into AI and machine learning. So, the whole goal around machine learning is a subset of AI, right? And so machine learning is an algorithm, and you've got to be able to feed this with a lot of really good data, and then obviously a lot of dirty data, right? And so it can learn and evolve over time. But machine learning is something that we're seeing more and more of. It's something that you want to consider, right, for a little bit more of that advanced threat that exists out there. Now we shift to detect and respond, right? And so endpoint detection and response. We'll talk about XDR later, but on the endpoint specifically, we want to be able to know what registry entries were changed or modified, what files were touched, what DNS, what network connections, maybe packet capture, insight into the overall activities that took place, right? Behavioral indicators that have been triggered. All of that becomes key, right? In understanding what took place. A forensic snapshot. So the ability to be able to take a snapshot. Remember, this asset's remote. So now how do I take that forensic snapshot? And when I need it, right? Based on maybe certain activities. Or maybe I'm being proactive. I know that there's, browser helper objects that exist that's malicious, and I need to scan the environment or assets or certain assets to see whether or not that exists out there. Host isolation, right? What if an asset's compromised? What do you do then, right? So you could use something like application blocking and add maybe explorer.exe to almost brick the asset. That might be an option, right? A cleaner option would be isolate the host and allow restricted connectivity, so you can continue to triage and do your analysis on the endpoint. Cloud-based IOCs. So, a file comes in from the network. It copies itself to multiple machines. It duplicates it on the hard drive. It sends content to an unknown IP, right? These could trigger a cloud-based IOC, right? Some type of indication of compromise, a little clue for you to dig in and do some further analysis on the endpoint. Command line capture, right? I want insight into the command line. Not that PowerShell was executed, but PowerShell was executed and the command line that was actually inserted was PowerCat -C IP address port 443, right? We want the details of exactly what that command line was. You've got sandbox and file analysis, right? And so sandboxing, again, is going to run a file in a virtual machine, and it's going to execute, and we're going to watch its behavior, and we're going to come out with a disposition. We also want to be able to use it to do analysis, right? Vulnerable software. Well, we said patching is important. Well, knowing whether or not systems are vulnerable is just as important, or software that's running on the system is vulnerable is just as important. IP fix flow, right? Correlation. So you might think endpoint detection and response is going to provide me network connectivity insight, and it will, but it may be limited to only a number of network connections. When you get into IP fix flow correlation, you're now grabbing every single application or process for every network connection that's going to be made. You're tracking everything. And now I can now run analytics against that as well. The goal here, though, is not to have these disparate. And if they are, you got to find a mechanism to pull these all back in. So that's a good visual on the endpoint. You might say, what about this or what about that, right? We haven't built this path out. Again, you can add as much as you need on the endpoint or along the path. It doesn't matter per se, but these are controls that you want to consider. DNS, right? Blocking at the domain level. So during that first or initial lookup, that first line of defense, we have an opportunity to block it before HTTP or any other protocol is established. So it's very early on, and it's an opportunity to centralize those DNS queries as well. Web proxy, the ability to proxy the connection. Right now we're proxying, it gives us an opportunity to do additional inspection like DLP, right? Data loss prevention. TLS decryption now becomes critical, because if we want to look inside encrypted payloads, we're going to have to tear open that encryption. And that includes TLS 1.3, which becomes a little bit more challenging. Advanced malware protection, right? Again, if we're not doing TLS decryption and it's an encrypted channel, then things like DLP and advanced malware inspection mean nothing, right? We need to be able to tear open that payload. DNS forensics, right? Now we move into the detect and respond, right? You have to consider both, because your prevention capability may fail. So DNS forensics, right? Centralizing all those DNS queries so I can look at the attack infrastructure or understand what potentially is the attack infrastructure. I also want to be able to understand maybe, files, their association to domains, what email addresses might be associated to a domain. And you remember, you're going to use everything that you learn in the detection phase to be able to respond elsewhere, and that response might be adding a email address to your email security offering, right? It might be adding an IP address to a block list. Full URI capture. Again, I want to know the exact URI that was executed as well. Sandbox file analysis, right? So this is an HTTP connection potentially, and so I'll want to sandbox that file and do an analysis, but it might be after the fact that I have to go to some type of portal mechanism to view that data forensically. And so you might see that, wait a minute, we called sandboxing out on the endpoint, or we called out advanced malware on the endpoint. Do we need it further upstream? And the answer is absolutely, you need it upstream. The reason being is the adversary is going to defeat your controls, right? And so on the endpoint, they may be shutting down the advanced malware capability. And now you have no control elsewhere, right? No ability to minimize that risk. And so yes, you do need those controls as you move upstream as well. If we zoom in on the internet connection, this could be split tunneling or direct to internet. We're going to access resources, right? And those resources might include additional capabilities. So that additional capability might be email. And so if I'm reaching out to email, I'm going to use this example for every connectivity type. I'm going to also want additional controls, right? Prevention capabilities in the platform. So that could be reputation filtering, right? When it comes to email, right? Spam, well, that's an obvious one. Business email compromise, right? We know that COVID-19 is more targeted, right? And so If I can and look and feel like somebody internally, my chances of someone clicking a link that I might be sharing increases significantly. Advanced malware protection. Again, I want to pull out that malware in the email attachment. I don't want to have to rely on those controls further downstream. The reason why I don't want to rely on those controls downstream is because then I need to be 100% correct as it gets closer to the endpoint. Once it's on the endpoint, if I fail to detect and prevent, it's game over. Gray mail, right? Phishing, URL protection, right? So maybe I want to rewrite that URL in the message body, right? Sandboxing. This is an opportunity that I can use sandboxing potentially as a prevention capability in this case, right? Because mail is not instant and I can hold it to allow enough time to do full sandboxing. Where an HTTP connection, I'm limited based on how long that timeout would be for that HTTP connection. And therefore, if I'm sandboxing, likelihood the file is going to end up on the endpoint if the other engines haven't detected it once before it lands. You got DLP as well, right? Considerations. And then you move into message tracking, right? Things like I want to look at the message and be able to query the details of that message. I want to do file analysis, right? So I talked about sandboxing, more of a prevention capability because I can do that with email. File analysis might be that as an analyst, I want to go into see my files centrally. So it could be through web, it could be through the endpoint, it could be through mail, but I want to visually see that in a central spot. Now we transition to VPN, okay? And when we look at VPN, we want to consider DDoS, right? We talked about that earlier, that we're seeing an increase in attack on VPN head ends because now I can disrupt businesses, right? It's easier actually to disrupt businesses today than it was before because you're 100% relying on that VPN connectivity to get any access to any services, where before access was still accessible if that internet gateway was actually being denial of service attack was taking place, because I still had access from the campus into the data center. TLS decryption, right? Again, I need to decrypt maybe this payload. Now this might be going through some firewall and I need to do, network-based advanced malware protection, or IPS as an example. Multi-factor authentication, right? So if I'm connecting to the VPN head end or other services, I probably want to add a second factor because we know credential theft is on the rise, and now the adversary can log in from anywhere, potentially, right? Endpoint posture. Let's check the endpoint, make sure it's in a position that makes us comfortable enough to consider a trust level of that asset that's connecting. If it's not updating or being patched, maybe we don't want to allow it unfettered access once it connects. We probably don't want unfettered access at all, right? We want to limit the access to what is required to function. Geo-based control. Now, some insecurity, especially on the adversarial side, or if you're a red teamer, you might be looking at the geo control as a very trivial control, right? Meaning that, it's very easy to proxy and bypass. The goal here is, as you see, we've gotten these layers, and the goal here is to make it very difficult for the adversary to be successful. So geo control, like many other controls all by themselves, isn't going to be very difficult for the adversary to overcome. The goal, though, is to make every step of the way difficult enough that it becomes a nuisance and the effort is outweighing the reward, right? So we'll move on, as the adversary will move on to something a little bit more easier. L7 type firewalling. Right now we're moving into the next generation firewall label. And looking at applications and giving access to applications based on that, on identifying them. Intrusion prevention, right? The ability to look at the payload and understand the payload. And if it's, for example, doing something malicious, we want to minimize that risk by blocking. Advanced malware and AV. Again, this is more of a network-based control. So this could be as simple as network-based malware detection platform. It could be integrated in other technologies as well. But you may have protocols that are coming across here that aren't just web-based. And therefore, it could be somebody, transferring a file as an example, or sharing a file. So again, you might want to consider those controls in each layer, right? Web was going to have a certain capability. Network's going to have a certain capability. Endpoint's going to have a certain capability. And hopefully the collection of all is going to make it very difficult for the adversary to be successful. Behavior-based policy. So things like understanding the endpoint, understanding the applications, maybe specific applications triggered by a specific asset, and a indication of a compromise from a specific geo. Now, enough of that enough of those indicators is enough to trigger some type of activity, whether that be an alert or some type of remediation or blocking effort. But having a better understanding of some of the behaviors that might take place is going to give you an advantage. Then you get web application firewalling, right? Again, the services that we're protecting may warrant that. Device insight, right? Now we're moving into detection and response. So device insight, I want to know what the device is. I want to know that posture, but also be able to use that from an analytics perspective, right? Denied authentications, right? This becomes key as well, right? This could be an indicator of credentials being stolen. If MFA, for example, is being triggered but failing, that's a good indication that there's a credential stolen, because most users, if they're getting or are trying to access a resource and they're being asked for that second factor, they're going to enter that second factor in, and there's going to be a successful authentication that takes place. Host profiling, understanding the endpoint, the applications that are running on the endpoint, being able to correlate that based on activities. So if an intrusion takes place, we can understand the impact that results based on that attack and the current position of that endpoint. Impact analysis obviously coincides with that host profiling. It's really hard to be able to provide impact analysis if you really don't understand the asset you're protecting. For example, a Linux-based attack that might trigger an IPS signature has no relevance to a Windows-based system. And therefore, understanding the host is going to allow me to give it some type of impact. So the analyst can say, wait a minute, impact 1 is very, very important, right? Impact 4, 3, or 2 might be less important. Sandbox and file analysis. Remember, now we're talking network-based control, and that exists as well. So you can see that we've seen sandboxing in multiple different areas, right? We've seen it on the endpoint, we've seen it in web, we've seen it in network, and we've seen it in email as well. Vulnerability insight. So again, understanding the asset that's connecting and how it might be traversing from a network perspective, we can understand maybe the current vulnerabilities on the system. And again, that helps us understand the intrusion that might have taken place, right? It might have exposed a vulnerability, and that's going to be key. Not only that, it's going to help us maybe rectify and patch those systems, right? Once they're identified. Flow analytics. So again, understanding how you communicate, get some type of behavioral baseline. So if all of a sudden that VPN connection is trying to access networks or subnets or particular host, by scanning them, I want to be able to detect that. Event packet capture. Right? This one's a big one because, again, forensically, I need this data. And what happens is that if you have an event that's triggered, maybe on an IPS, a lot of times the packet capture is not there. And so you've got a missing piece of the puzzle, and then you go and turn it on. So this is something that you want to have in play, especially work from home, right? They're connecting, they have access to that environment, most likely 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so you don't want to miss that one-time attack that takes place. Event flow correlation. Or event workflow. So the ability to be able to drill down into an event, right, and understand that event and be able to pivot into different elements of the attack cycle. So you might want to look specifically at, maybe impact one. If you can classify events by impact, you understand the impact. Now you see all the impacts. You might want to drill into a specific event and then understand that event more as you drill in deeper, maybe all the way down to maybe the packet itself. And then you have a service on the other end. And I'm not going to walk through email again because we've already done that, but you get the idea. Whatever that service is on the other end, there might be additional capabilities that you have to add. Now we move into SaaS-based access. And so, this is a little bit different. We see a transition in the market towards a SaaS-based access using native TLS, where now you don't have to worry about running an overlay on top of it to only run a secured channel underneath the overlay like a VPN. And so now we get into multi-factor authentication again, right? Because now we're logging into an application. That application may have sensitive data on it that's proprietary to the organization. So again, we know that they're going after credentials, so we want to add that second factor. Endpoint posture, right? It doesn't change here, right? So if that SaaS-based application is critical, we might want to also posture the device. If there's malware on the device, maybe we don't want to allow access to certain applications or any application, right? Geo control, again, maybe there's some things here that are very sensitive and they're and they could be, as an example, this could be a web service, maybe on premise. So maybe not SaaS, but web service that is proprietary, but you've exposed it through TLS 1.3 as an example to the internet to allow access to clients as an example. I'm not saying this is a good idea. I'm just, walking through this. Adding geo control might say, only allow this geo to connect, right? Based on the posture of the device and that multi-factor authentication. Restrict non-sanctioned applications. So we've got to think about this, right? Is if we have a file repository of OneDrive, we may want to consider limiting access to other file repositories in the cloud. Users are savvy, and so if they need to access something or there's something being blocked, they're going to go to another mechanisms and share that data, and now you no longer have any control over that data. So again, that control might be something you want to consider. SaaS-based DLP, so the application itself that you're delivering, there might be DLP capabilities that you want to add to that as well. Again, device insight, denied authentications, right? Those are things we've already talked about. You also get into shadow IT. We want to identify other applications that you might be accessing, and then either deny or understand what they are from a trust perspective, right? So community trust insight is helpful in making those decisions, and eventually make them sanction-based applications so the corporation owns the application that users are using. User entity and behavioral analytics. So this is where you get into, a user logging in Edmonton as an example to Office 365, and then logs into Salesforce from Africa 15 minutes later. And so, based on current travel times, it's impossible to be in those two locations within 15 minutes. And so there's an ability to be able to correlate those disparate systems and say, wait a minute, here's an activity that took place. What do you want to do? And it could be an indication of credential compromise. Maybe one has MFA and the other doesn't, right? Either or, the credential was stolen and somebody's logged in and passed that first factor. And then you get into the service, right? And if it's an email service, you still got to consider, the security elements that service requires that fall outside of all the other controls that we've put in place. And so this is what it looks like, right? And you've got a couple of use cases, right? SaaS, VPN, internet, and don't look at those as termination points, right? Look at that as the flow, right? So anywhere you want to put this control, you have the ability to do that. And so that's fine. We've now hopefully centralized. First off, hopefully we were able to insert these controls. Second would be, now we've got to think about it. If we don't have these controls, we want to think about, if we do add these controls, what complexity have we added to the security operations team, right? And folks that are managing these systems. So we start moving into pulling it all together, right? These could be disparate systems. You've got to think about how you're going to pull this all together to help accelerate incident response. So ideally you want API-based platforms that we can query and respond to, right? And so, for example, if I'm able to ask a question, pull all the data back, get some results, and then hopefully take action based on the information I'm being given from that console, that's going to be tremendously valuable, right? Again, if you have to log into multiple systems, it's doable. It's just very hard work, right? Then you get into orchestration, automation, and playbooks, right? So the ability to say certain activities that take place, right? And you think of it from a work from home user, right? If it's a phishing attack, there's these things that you want to do. Maybe you want to, the moment it happens, I want to take the observations or indicators. I want to query the rest of my other data set and get some insight into it. Then I also want to correlate with certain individuals. I want to send an email address. I want to do a forensic snapshot on the endpoint, right? So these are things that you want to think about, especially if it's work from home. How are you going to be able to facilitate that? What if the VPN tunnel's not up, right? How am I going to be able to do that? And then you have threat intelligence, right? You've got obviously vendor-based threat intelligence, you've got open source threat intelligence, and then you've got your own sourced intelligence. And so how are you going to consume all of that and share that with the entire security ecosystem that you've built? And so as you go through this, one thing I thought I would add here is, incident response, right? So Incident Response Consortium, or IRC, is a great place to kind of build out these playbooks. And, obviously, there's certain elements that are people and process, but there's also technologies that you can help automate some of this stuff and pull the data in to allow your analysts to analyze the data sooner and much easier than having to action this. But this kind of walks through what that might look like. Right? So you've got to first prepare, right? So this is the workflow. This is phishing. Prepare. So we need to determine the core ops team and define those roles: vulnerability manager, threat manager, risk manager, right? We want to review and maintain that timeline. You've got some interviews that you're going to do. And then you've got some documentation, both internally and externally. Then you're going to move into detect. We got to understand the threat indicators. Right? And so we need to define those. So if it's spoofing, we might want to take certain activities, right? Versus, there's an external unknown URL, or there's an attachment that comes back as malicious. We want to define what those threat indicators are, and there might be some that are custom. We want to categorize the incident. We may want to request a packet capture. We might want to conduct content scans, right? So this is to help us detect a specific indicator that might be out there and take certain steps. Then we want to analyze that data, right? Is there PII information? Is it public or personal safety affected? Again, we want to define that risk factor. There's going to be standard-based risk factors, but there's also going to be some specific to your organization. And then we move into determine patch methods, log collection, evidence collection, data capture, and analysis, right? Then we move into the next step where we're going to contain. Again, we're going to identify systems that have been affected. identify user credentials compromised, identify the IT services, and it goes on, right? It identify any source attribution collected, how widespread the attack is, identify tools used to detect the attack itself. Then we move into the next step. And now we're going to eradicate. So triage and confirm the incident report. So test implementation, contain phishing sample, test malware eradication procedure. We're going to do some communications. And then we're going to actually execute the eradication of malware as an example, right? So add, change, remove affected systems or sites from the network. Again, the more manual this is, the more difficult it is to be successful. You still can be successful, but there's going to be time to be able to, time's going to elapse, right, in order for you to get through all of this. But I really believe it's a good idea to kind of grab some of these playbooks if you don't have them today, especially for work from home. Build out these playbooks. And so you have them, right? And go through some mock exercises and fine tune them. Ultimately, if you can automate some of this, you certainly want to do this. Now we move into recover, right? So what are we going to do to recover systems? Is it going to be a reimage? Is there updates? Maybe there's an email filter action that's going to be added. And then incident remediation, right? And so maybe wipe and baseline systems, scan hosts with updated signature, remove vulnerabilities and update routers, etc. Whatever the case might be. And then post-incident handling, right? Now we get into incident review, lessons uncovered, lessons applied, and then finally response workflow updated, right? So again, incident review is in lessons learned is going to be critical in your success for the next incident, because every incident you're going to get better. And that's it, right? When you think about it, it's not really that difficult. Taking a step back and looking at it from a flow perspective provides advantages, especially if you don't have the controls today in place. It's great to be able to say, wait a minute, we've got this VPN capacity thing figured out. Everyone's able to access the network. Now let's holistically take a step back and build out that security platform that we require in order to fully secure our assets, whether they're connected to the internet directly through split tunneling, they're connected to VPN, or they're connecting to SaaS-based applications. We want to make sure that we have prevention capabilities in play, including the ability to detect and respond in case any of those controls fail.